hope for me with the images that I create is that they'll reach an individual person, touch them in a way emotionally, curiosity, awe. Just being in awe of something is an amazingly powerful emotion and tool to pull people in.
Thank you for joining us again on the Voices of Greater Yellowstone podcast. This is producer Emmy Reed, filling in for Kristen Oxford as she recorded this podcast episode, then headed out to live her Ernest Shackleton dreams on a cruise to Antarctica. Hopefully with a few more creature comforts and an intact ship. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Although sometimes it feels like we're left speechless when viewing the spectacular photos and film of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. People from across the globe who have never visited this remarkable region feel a connection simply from the story these images tell. From a bird's eye view of Grand Prismatic Spring to a sweet moment of a grizzly bear sow and her cubs, to the sheer vastness that is Greater Yellowstone, the moments captured via camera inspire us all. On today's episode, we're thrilled to welcome Ronan Donovan, conservation storyteller and National Geographic photographer. From cutting his teeth on the 2016 Yellowstone edition of National Geographic Magazine, to focusing on the relationship between people and wolves across the globe, Ronan uses his brilliant photography and cinematography to share intimate scenes of wildlife and the importance of conservation. We chat about his favorite moments in the field, the elusive Greater Yellowstone species he has yet to capture on film, and the power of awe. We also have a surprise giveaway at the end of the show, so stick around to find out how you can participate. All right, let's dive into conservation storytelling through a lens with Ronan Donovan.
My name is Ronan Donovan, and I work mostly in kind of the education space. It's become visual storytelling, photography, film work, but it's all surrounding conservation issues, and I use those visual tools to educate people about challenges and successes and things to look forward to in the future.
Wonderful. And tell us a bit about how you found photography. Was it always on your radar as a potential career?
It wasn't really. I mean, I look back and I liked taking pictures. I took a black and white film class in high school, my freshman year, but the pictures were terrible. I mean, it was like my friends, it was like pose stuff, it was just random, the frozen leaf on the ground, kind of the classic stuff, I guess. And then never really revisited it. I had kind of little small point and shoot digital, I remember, and I would take pictures when I traveled. But it wasn't like it was just kind of like a visual diary. And like even in college, nothing visual in any of the studies that I did. And then it wasn't until after college, I almost went into a road of finance in Boston. It was kind of like a peer pressure thing. Felt like that was the track. My partner at the time was getting a job in Boston. Some friends got jobs in Boston. My dad got me some interviews. It was kind of like a easy maybe. And then after experiencing the interviews and what the job descriptions were, it was an easy no. Was offered both jobs and then just said no way. And then bounced around in New Hampshire and Maine, worked in the lobster industry. And then got back to, like, initially I studied wildlife management at school, at university, and then switched to business. But I went back to the wildlife management, got an internship in Yosemite National Park. And that was probably like 2006, right after college, maybe 6-7 months after college. And I bought a film camera before I went, just like a used Canon with a couple of used lenses on eBay for like $400. And had the idea that I was like, oh, I'm going to go on this trip. I'm going to get a camera and see what happens. And then that was it. That was like the obsession was on, both with, the wildlife research and with photography.
I mean, what a better place to get into film photography than Yosemite, following in the footsteps of Ansel Adams. And
I think that it offered so much. Mm-hmm. Like there was so much opportunity in terms of, there's an Ansel Adams gallery in the valley of Yosemite. The valley itself is stunning and breathtaking. And then I was doing this spotted owl project and we were catching and banding and monitoring the life cycle of spotted owls in old growth forest with sequoia trees. It was absolutely amazing, and just kind of this major eye-opening and turning point for me, having grown up in rural Vermont and, rural kid, outside all the time, walk through the woods along the brook 1.5 miles to the bus stop both ways every day with our dogs. And, it was a lovely kind of close to nature upbringing. But, east of the Mississippi is just heavily manicured by Europeans, and the forests have been logged 3 times plus going on succession of that kind of management, no large predators. So yeah, going to Yosemite wasn't amazing, and it is still.
Yeah, it's a really remarkable place. So film camera in hand, you're working with wildlife, you're out west. What then drew you to the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem?
Yeah, my dad brought me out to first the Wind River Mountains when I was probably like 12 or 13. My dad, he's 80 now, still every year leads an outward bound course in sailing around Hurricane Island in Maine. And he did that full time for a few years before I was born. But so he's kind of comes from that thought of the outdoor experiential learning. And so my brother and I were raised kind of in that school. And so he brought me out to the winds. We just picked a lake on a map and just like bushwhacked in. And it was, passing bighorn sheep and catching beautiful fish and setting up a base camp and kind of just doing these big circuits up to these other lakes, and, encountering like chipmunks that hadn't seen people, and they just kind of come right up to you, and not because they'd been fed, but because they hadn't seen people. And just kind of this wilderness scale and potential and possibility that I had never experienced before in the East. And so that was planted early on as an early teen. And then, after Yosemite, bounced around doing different wildlife biology jobs all around the world. And it was a partner and I that moved to Polson, Montana. So that was the first town. We never heard of it. We looked on the map, and the next town south is Ronan, Montana, or Ronan, as they say in Montana. So it was kind of fortuitous, interesting. And that was probably 2007, 2008. And then bounced around Kalispell, Polson, Helena, and then moved to Bozeman in 2014.
Wow. So you're in Montana. You've made your way to Bozeman. At what point do you transition from working in wildlife management to considering yourself more of a photographer professionally?
It was probably on and off for the 8 years that I was working in, wildlife field biology work. So I was doing stuff with spotted owls, marine mammals, chimpanzees. I worked for Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks for a couple summers, doing non-game baseline surveys across the state. So it was in eastern Montana and then western Montana, and that was all the little critters. And all throughout, I was crafting and kind of honing the photography skill in kind of the basic, like how to use a camera, how to get interesting pictures, how to keep things in focus, composure or composition, all these things, kind of the basics. But I didn't really know anything about like storytelling and how to actually use pictures in a way to engage people, create awe and wonder, but also curiosity, and then to educate and pull people in. So there was kind of this restlessness that I had with photography and video too. I was doing both, but just for fun. And at some point it was this kind of burning desire to put the pictures and the imagery to work in some way. And how do I do that? How do I get people to care about, sage grouse that I was filming their breeding behavior and taking pictures, and how do I get these pictures to actually be useful and helpful towards conservation? At the same time, I'm reading and seeing and traveling around the world and seeing the ecological decline that has been happening for the last, hundreds, if not longer, years under this idea of kind of economics and capitalism and perpetual growth model that isn't sustainable in any natural sense. So I was kind of having this worldview shift, or just education that was happening. And I wanted to use photography to somehow contribute to ecological education and to conservation. And so I was kind of having these like little assignments maybe that would come up. I did some bird photography. That was my first assignment, was for a magazine in Africa when I was there doing chimpanzee research. I photograph. I love all the things. I'm a true naturalist in the sense that like I'm very intrigued by any natural processes. I don't just focus on the big stuff, or some people just focus on birds, but I love everything: insects, reptiles, amphibians, all of it. And so I had a couple of these small assignments when this is 2011, kind of still considered a biologist by profession, but I had pitched this story about these 5 endemic bird species that only live in these papyrus swamps throughout sub-Saharan Africa. And so I went out, and it was really fun, just kind of this like scavenger hunt to try to find. Some of the birds were easy, some of them were really hard, and really localized. And so I was traveling around Uganda mostly is where I did the story. And so it was kind of, that felt like the style that I wanted to do in terms of like combining text, photography. There was some maps involved with some science. The foundation is always kind of empirical data and science and research. And so there was a taste there of how to use photography in the way that felt impactful.
Several years ago, you worked on the National Geographic Magazine Yellowstone edition. How did you decide which wildlife to focus on for that project, and how to capture those shots and how to really tell that story?
That was my first assignment for National Geographic Magazine, 2014. I was kind of on the radar of an editor that worked for the magazine. I had done a year of research in Uganda studying chimpanzees, using photography as a research tool, for a professor who asked me also to, hey, could you climb trees that, these fig trees that chimps will visit for weeks at a time while they're ripened, while the fruits are ripened, and photograph and video them kind of in their natural environment up high, instead of being on the ground looking up at kind of these dark silhouetted figures, which is the normal view. And then that professor forwarded those pictures on to an editor at National Geographic Magazine, Kathy Moran, and she was in charge of, basically she was editing this entire issue for National Geographic that was solely on the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. It came out in 2016. And so they had sent a team of photographers. There was, 6 photographers or so, some of these big names in our world that I looked up to for my young days: Nick Nichols, Erica Larson, Charlie Hamilton James, Joe Reese, Drew Rush. Just kind of this amazing cast of photographers that had been working in the conservation wildlife space for decades. And so I wasn't initially part of that team. It was maybe like 6 months into the project. Nick's long-term assistant had decided to take another job in Gabon. Like it was like a 5-year contract or something like that. And so Nick needed like very quickly a camera trap assistant. And I had learned camera traps and kind of had a basic understanding. These were the days when camera traps were kind of like you'd buy some stuff off the shelf and then you had to like cobble together, and like you had to like change some wiring in order to get Canon cameras to talk to Nikon flash. And I don't know, it was just, you had to make your own boxes. It was just kind of like this fun little handyman type project. And so I had some of that skill, just the baseline. And so I signed a 2-week contract. The editor said, you're going to go out and have a first date with Nick in Yellowstone and see if you guys get along and see if it works. And it was just a really magical time for me just to be part of this amazing team, to be working towards this really amazing and inspiring publication that I grew up leafing through the pages of National Geographic like a lot of people. And so I was initially there just to assist Nick. And that was a kind of myriad of different projects. Like Nick was focused on bison, grizzly bears. He was doing some wolf stuff. But he had, all these camera trap locations, and my job was to scout, set up, and maintain the camera traps. And so, we had some at these kind of carcass sites. We had really special permitting that allowed us to do this. You can't put camera traps out in Yellowstone National Park, but we had really special permitting that was gotten through National Geographic in Washington, D.C. We put them out at 6 wolf dens, put cameras out at 6 wolf dens through the parks. That was working with the Yellowstone Wolf Project, Doug Smith at the time and his team. And then there was this site called the Bear Bathtub that we also put some cameras out. Nick was doing photos, I was doing video, but it was my job to go out and kind of scout and maintain all that. And then I was asked to kind of contribute my own piece, photographing wolves and working with the Yellowstone Wolf Project.
So how did it feel to have signed on to this project in sort of an assistant capacity, and then suddenly you're being asked to contribute work centered on wolves, which are one of the absolute icons of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem?
It was a dream come true. I mean, it was being around so many inspiring storytellers, photographers, and then embedding with all of these equally inspiring scientists and professional Park Service employees who have dedicated their lives to better understanding the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Doug Smith and Carrie Gunther, Doug with the Wolf Project, Carrie with the Bear Management Project. They were just and are incredible champions for unraveling kind of the complexities of the natural world in also the human-dominated landscape. They would work in Yellowstone, but they fully understood that Yellowstone is just a piece of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And so it was the most exciting time for me in photography and kind of this new career that I wanted that was seemingly attainable. And having these really, it was the first time I had these really in-depth conversations about photography and specifically how to create an image that would tell the story about whatever the piece was that we're trying to convey. And then using all these tools to do that, using all these custom camera trap systems that were designed in this cool engineering basement at National Geographic at the headquarters in DC, and working with Charlie Hamilton James to try to rewire a GoPro to make it into a camera trap to be able to submerge it in this bear bathtub and try to get some different pictures, and kind of this fun, exciting, curious, expansive time for me where you're just all of a sudden around these people that are way ahead of you and can teach you a lot about this craft that I'd been kind of tinkering with but didn't have a community. And so my community was science and researchers, and but to be around the visual artists and storytellers and creators was just it was amazing. It will stand out as just kind of this really amazing time capsule that was really impactful for me.
Yeah, probably not a lot of folks who can trace the beginning of their photographic careers to a National Geographic project. So that's pretty cool. But I have to ask, what is a bear bathtub? Is that a place where bears are going and splish splashing in the water?
It is, yeah. The bear bathtub is this really fascinating physical feature in kind of the heart of Yellowstone. And it was discovered by Carrie Gunther. He had a caller out, a radio caller out on a grizzly bear, and they're programmed to drop off before they go into hibernation. There's no use to have a caller in hibernation, and so they pop off in the fall. And there was a caller that had popped off, and this was not a GPS caller, it was a radio caller, and so in order to find it, you have to fly and with a radio receiver on the plane and basically kind of do a grid in the area where maybe that bear had hung out when the caller popped off. And so he got a signal in this area and went in to recover this caller. And it's this really beautiful kind of small, maybe 50 feet by 80 feet little meadow at high elevation, and there's an upwelling spring. It's not heated, but it's a little spring. And he noticed there was some kind of trails, game trails, animal trails that were coming into this, through the grass, coming into this little water source. And he kept getting signals somewhere in there. And then eventually he kind of wandered over the little pool that is just kind of as big as this table. It's maybe like 4 feet by 7 feet. And the caller was in the pool at the bottom.
Wow.
And so he fished it out and kind of like, remembered that, cataloged that in his brain, like, I guess, the bear was getting a drink or something and it popped off. What timing kind of thing. And so that was, I think, early 2000s, maybe 2003, if I remember, that experience happened. And then in 2013, 14, during the initial meetings for the National Geographic project, Nick Nichols showed a photo and a video about this watering hole in India where these tigers would come, and this specific tiger eventually like lowered itself down in this pool and like sat there, like sleeping. And then you can literally like hear like people's voices in the distance and maybe like a dog barking or something, and the tiger like opens its eyes and gets out of this pool. It's a very hot part of this in India, and so the tiger was cooling off. And it reminded Carrie, there's this pool in Yellowstone where I found this caller, and he relayed this information to Nick after he saw that video. And so Nick sent me in initially, I think it was in August. I went out with a Park Service employee on the bear management team, Nate Bowersock, and checked out this pool and kind of like went in and scouted it, put up a couple cameras just to see what was happening as a potential. And came back. Actually, I think I was with my dad for the second visit. He came in with me. I always had to be in 2s or 3s. And came in, and the camera had been messed with and was all like muddied up. And I was both excited and heartbroken, thinking that the thing happened. In wildlife with photography and imagery, you don't know how often things happen. And so you think like maybe this only happens once in a blue moon. Once a year, one bear came by, and that, you don't know. And so I thought that I had missed it. I was super frustrated. Camera traps are a lot of frustration because you don't have full control over the equipment, the picture, the batteries, the card, whether it just gets a bunch of false triggers or if animals mess with it. Simply like an elk coming by and licking the lens, or a bear coming by and rearranging it is, you're done, basically, in terms of getting the imagery you want. And so I actually, I didn't even look at the footage, just saw that it was moved, was kind of happy that something came by. I don't know if it went in the water or not. Ended up bringing the footage back, bringing the card back, gave it to Nick. And I remember sitting in the living room in Park Service housing in Mammoth, and Nick was like scrubbing through the footage. He downloaded it to the computer, and he was like, oh man, like holy smokes, Ronan, like there's a bear in the bathtub. Like the camera had been rearranged, but you could still see part of this little pool.
Wow.
And this bear went in and was like fully submerged up to its shoulders, neck and head just above, kind of like splashing around, like, a dog getting in a pool and cooling off. And so then we just took it to another level, put some more cameras out, and it turned into this really fascinating localized spot where black bears, grizzly bears, males, females, with all ages of cubs, fresh little tiny cubs of the year coming in and swimming around, splashing around. Some of these big male grizzly bears got in just like that tiger, sat down, just their heads up for, I think 20 minutes or so. One was in there, and then like falling asleep, just soaking in this pool. And again, it's not heated, it freezes in winter. And so, I did a couple seasons. I got funding and permission to do another fall there and put out more cameras. It's this really fascinating pool, and kind of this it's part of the joy of camera trapping and wildlife discovery. Bear biologists didn't know this was happening, kind of at this level with this many bears and in this place. And Carrie and some others are still doing research there and putting out cameras and being being curious and trying to understand like what's this behavior about, what's going on.
Hey, self-care is important for all species.
Exactly.
I just, that is such a great story, and what a wonderful discovery. I like this idea in my head that the first bear that went there after you put the first camera up was like, excuse me, I'm having private bath time.
Exactly.
I'm going to rearrange this for you.
Yes.
No, that's great. Thanks for sharing that story. So since the National Geographic Yellowstone project, how has your work evolved? It sounds like that was a tremendous learning experience in addition to just being a really wonderful experience. But, did you start after that doing anything differently?
I think I did everything differently after that. It was, Nick is a mentor and just kept drilling in, as well as the editor, Kathy Moran, about storytelling. And it's, about the series of pictures. It's about photo essays. It's about combining the imagery, not just single picture gets you in the door or it gets the reader or the viewer curious, but the impact is in the series. And so trying to figure out how to make pictures that are truly about storytelling, covering as many of the angles and bases, literally and figuratively, as you can. And so every story that I approach now is there's the animal component. And that's what drew me into photography in the beginning, was just observing wildlife and being a naturalist. But now a lot of what I do is there's a huge component, if not the main components, about people, about humans, and about their interaction with the landscape, if it's about a place, or that species, if it's about an animal. And ultimately that was and is still a big learning process and turning point, in the sense that conservation is not about managing animals. It's about managing people and how people choose to engage with, how they choose to resource conservation projects, or how they decide to care about something or not. Mm-hmm. And that is what essentially in the modern era, with the capacity of modern humans, that's what conservation is how do we shape human values and in a way that is beneficial for humans and wildlife, humans and landscapes. And so that a lot of what I do now is in that space. That's kind of the education piece, is a lot of what I lean into now. It's not just about pictures. I'm still at the core a scientist, I feel like, a biologist, and I see the biodiversity crisis and trying to contribute some positive change through the skill sets that I have developed through photography and film. And so I just use these visual tools as the entry point. But really, to me, it doesn't stop at the images. It's about, that's just the hook, to get people in, to get people interested. And it's tricky, it's challenging. I constantly am trying to kind of reevaluate the type of work that I do and how I do it. I have a museum exhibit that's traveling now about wolves. It was in Jackson, Wyoming last year. It's in Bend, Oregon now. And it's become a really fascinating and new avenue for me to communicate these complex issues around wolves. And it's comparing wolves in the human-dominated landscape in the Greater Yellowstone to wolves in the wolf-dominated landscape of the high Arctic in Canada. And so that's a whole different kind of experience for people coming through this physical space, and tons of detailed captions and writing. We worked on it for a couple of years with National Geographic. And then I organize, panel discussions and opening talks and kids programming. So kind of doing this whole educational package along with the visuals of the wolves. And so I'm constantly trying to kind of explore new ways of communicating and storytelling.
Yeah, we think about climate change a lot as being this huge existential crisis, and communicating about climate change is really difficult because it's scary and it's huge and it's overwhelming. So, if you are showing people images of wolves in the Arctic, how do you feel like that? Do you feel like that's like a hook for getting people to care about something very specific so that you can also introduce these broader concepts of issues like climate change?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's spot on. It's essentially trying to pull people in kind of a roundabout way to what's happening in the Arctic. It's sometimes people can turn off about kind of really challenging human interest stories. There's a whole section of the public, it seems, that you can pull them in through wildlife, through kind of this quote like innocent subject matter, where it's the wolves aren't creating climate change, or the musk oxen, or these other animals, polar bears, that are kind of struggling with this changing environment. And so there's a lot of amazing coverage of the human challenges that are happening in the high Arctic with indigenous cultures that are losing land and losing ice and losing hunting access, and just everything that comes with climate change and the human landscape. And my skill set is in the wildlife space, and in kind of going back to my dad's teachings of the outdoor experiential learning. Like a lot of what I do, a lot of my skill, half of it is just like getting there and being comfortable and staying there for a long time in just some uncomfortable places. And so pulling people in, embedding with a family of wolves, and I did a 3-part series for National Geographic, Wild, on TV about this family of wolves in the Canadian high Arctic, is another entry point to add to the conversation about climate change. People can relate to these wolves potentially if they have turned off maybe to some of the human stories. They can be like, oh, okay, this climate change is actually affecting these animals that are like us, trying to make a living on the landscape. So it's kind of another entry point to talk about climate change, where you get people, you're just communicating a story. These are wild family lives that live in this place that a lot of the world doesn't understand, has never been, never will go, above 60 degrees north or so. Mm-hmm. Most of the world lives much further south than that. And so it's kind of this, it's a challenge to highlight places that are really far away as well, that are really far away from, the actual control of the people that are going to be watching it. But it's important, I feel like, because it's, what we do at the southern latitudes, what we do here and further south in terms of industry and carbon emissions affects the poles drastically. I mean, the Arctic's warming 4 times the rate of the rest of the world. And, there's that number changes, seems like year to year, just discovering like, oh, how fast it's changing. And so being able to highlight stories that are at kind of the leading edge of climate change is really important.
So speaking of getting comfortable being in a place for a long period of time, in your experience, are the kind of best or most exciting or most impactful shots that you've gotten the result of a lot of meticulous planning, or are they the things that have happened a little more spontaneously?
It's both, I feel like. There's the initial kind of preparation of being in the place. So, let's say in Yellowstone, there was a little window of a couple weeks where the Park Service gave myself and Nick access to Hayden Valley. It was in March, so it was a low snow year, 2014-15. It was open to admin travel, so Park Service employees could drive on the road because it was clear and open, but it wasn't open to the public. And all this stuff's happening all winter long in Yellowstone in terms of wildlife. And so, we have the equipment, we have the skill, we have the preparation, we have the ability to sit in the snow for days at a time, and we had the access. And so there were these bison carcasses that had fallen through the ice in winter and drowned on the Yellowstone River, and then a shallow section they ran aground, so to speak. And these male grizzly bears know about this site, and they kind of wake up early and go troll the river corridor and look for a meal. And then they'd kind of pull these carcasses to the shore to make it easier for them to feed on. And then there were several wolf packs that were using those carcasses as well, feeding on them. That's like kind of the baseline presence and skill. And then access is huge. That's kind of everything with photography, is having that access and being granted permission to do the work. And then the rest of it, again, half is probably just like there and luck. You can't control what animals do pretty much all the time. At least the style of photography that I do is just be there and wait and document. So that, again, access is kind of everything. There's a lot of these projects where it's just with people, the goal for me and the work that I do with wildlife is to find an animal that I can spend 24 hours with and walk 360 degrees all around it at close proximity all the time. That's kind of the dream. And same with people. Like, you get access to telling a story about a person's life, and ultimately you want to be able to photograph them while they're sleeping, let's say. Like, have that level of access and trust, because the best pictures are made that way, with proximity and time. I don't want to try to make an image about an animal in 2 weeks or something like that, or in a day going out. There's seasonality, there's behavior, there's breeding season, there's a lot of complexity to their lives, and so spending that time is what National Geographic has offered, and it's the dream for making images.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It sounds like the more prepared you are, the more opportunities you have for luck to show up as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what do you think is the most difficult species of wildlife to photograph in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem? Is there anything you haven't captured yet that you'd like to?
I mean, wolverines are just, come on, they're super hard. And they're just such low densities they exist at. So not a lot on the landscape in certain areas. I think there's an estimate of like 300 in the lower 48, something like that. And that includes, the Northern Rockies from the GYE up north through Glacier, and then some in the Cascades, but some in Idaho too. But that's it. They're these crazy little weasels that do some wild stuff. It's Wolverine Way, the book by Doug Chadwick. Great entry point to learn about wolverines. Yeah, I've just seen a few of them in Glacier, just up in Logan Pass, kind of just bombing around on the snow, doing their thing. That's one that would be very hard. There's only a few records in Yellowstone over the years of wolverines. Lynx, never seen one. That's a tough one. Yeah, they have lynx in Yellowstone. A least weasel, the smallest weasel. I've never seen one. I found a dead one. I see tracks. But we have 3 small weasels, long-tailed, short-tailed, and then least. Mm-hmm. And the least is like this little meat-seeking missile that is like, turns all white in winter, doesn't keep the black tip on the tail like the other 2 species. And I've never seen one yet.
Like how little are we talking?
I feel like their body is maybe like under 8 inches. Wow. And then a couple more with the tail. I mean, they're really small. Yeah, just like a rodent specialist. Mm-hmm. They're just like a snake with legs. They just go into the holes after the rodents. It's kind of a nightmare if you're a small furry thing.
Oh. So I know you've done work with trail cameras as well. How do you decide where to put up a trail camera, and how does that compare to your more traditional wildlife photography?
Yeah, trail cameras and camera traps, they are kind of this a love-hate tool that is used in the landscape. Love them because it offers 24-hour coverage of pictures happening in this specific place in the landscape that, I could be sleeping and I'm kind of like working in the sense that there's this camera or a camera system or a few cameras that are out there taking pictures if something's happening. And then the hate relationship is that you're not in control. You're setting up, if it's a nocturnal species, like I've done recently with some camera trapping with beavers, and so they're mostly nocturnal. They come out of the water at night and find a tree or little saplings and chew on them, and so trying to photograph them. So your camera, motion trigger, light system, all trying to make it hardy. It's got to be obviously waterproof, weatherproof, cow-proof sometimes, if that's possible. You're just trying to avoid all of these things that could happen. But the reward is just, it's amazing. You can see these animals that literally we never see, like wolverines or lynx, or, beavers doing stuff in the dark. It's not possible to see for us. So choosing locations, there's kind of like two different types of camera traps, kind of in my view. There's the trail camera trap or trail camera where it's like an animal passing by on a game trail, and you get, a lot of different kind of opportunities. You can get a lot of different species. Charlie Hamilton James has this cool series of images from a trail down in Grand Teton with like the Grand Teton mountain in the background. And there's black bear, grizzly bear, there's mountain lion, there's deer. So it's just kind of this cool census, this visual census, and it's, composed, and it's with a big professional camera trap. So like we were using like Canon 5D Mark IVs, or, something like a single lens reflex camera, or now, mirrorless camera that's put in this box and then having flash. So it's a really high quality image at the end. And so that's kind of, the trail camera literally is one of the styles. And then there's another style that I really try to go for a lot, is like the behavioral camera trap. And so that is going to be at some sort of a location on the landscape, back to beavers, a tree that they've been chewing on and working on, let's say a big cottonwood tree that's, maybe like 4 foot in diameter. It's going to take them months or even years to work on. And so setting up there, trying to get the lighting right, trying to get the image, visualize where the beaver is going to be and facing and how it's going to be chewing, and setting up a camera for that. So that's more of like behavior, trying to get, so beavers, let's say, or wolves, if they're social animals, trying to get multiple individuals in a photo, in a camera trap photo. Like that's kind of for me, that's the ultimate for behavior, where, maybe there's a couple beavers chewing on the tree, or, with wolves, I've put cameras on carcasses. So that's like a guaranteed spot where animals are going to come. And for wolves, if that's your subject, you try to create this, I've with wolves, a lot of times they don't handle flash. They're like, they barely handle the camera. Like around here, wolves are very shy. They're hunted, they're trapped in or outside of Yellowstone National Park. And so a lot of the wolves, even in Yellowstone, are wary of human things and human scent, because they leave the park for, maybe 5% of their time, and they can get hunted and trapped. And so they're scared of people, which is good. But it makes it hard to take pictures of them. And so a lot of times with wolves, I strip the camera system down to no flash, just ideally like a single box with a motion sensor on the box. So you're just like putting this one thing on a landscape. Ideally, it would be quiet, like a mirrorless system, and then taking thousands of pictures. So it's different than like the trail sets of cameras. You're like going for like one moment, or you get like 2 or 3 fast photos maybe, but it's like you have a beam break, which is a infrared beam that when it's broken, it triggers the camera, and it's a very specific place, and you light it accordingly with the animal facing a certain direction. But with these kind of like stripped down sets of cameras around carcasses, or the beaver thing, it's kind of like you're going for a lot of hits. So you're trying to like create and get all the bodies, and if it's, I've put them on carcasses where you get like just like 8 wolves that are moving around, and like half the pictures are a mess of bodies and fur, or someone sitting on the camera, or they're blocking things. But sometimes you get, let's say, layering. Let's say like a wolf is standing in front of the camera, but then you can see past its foot, 2 faces, eyeballs, other wolves doing things, and then you get kind of the magic of this composition that happens, and you can predict some of it, but a lot of times it's a surprise.
So bathing bears aside, what is one of the most unexpected things that you have found in your footage after the fact?
Well, yeah, with the bear bathtub specifically, we were there to try to get photos and videos of bears, but then like elk were coming and visiting, and there was this one, bull elk that's in the water and just splashing around for a little while, and then this cow elk came in and just kind of went like frisky, like got the zoomies and was like stomping and splashing, like it's all muddy and like kicking stuff all over the cameras, and it was just she was having a fun time, I guess, just like splashing around and romping. There were a bunch of different birds. There were Clark's nutcrackers coming down. We had some pine grosbeaks, some flickers, some crossbills. It was kind of a fun little surprise with all these other animals that were visiting it. And we'd get even a big male grizzly comes, and then just like 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, there'd be like a black bear with 3 cubs of the year. And she would come in and she could smell that he was just there. But I don't know, it was an interesting kind of like we never saw any territorial disputes at the bathtub. They're going up high elevation that time of year. A certain percentage of the bears in the GYE utilize white bark pine. And this was a white bark pine forest. And a lot of the bears, grizzly bears included, and black bears, will take advantage of the red squirrel's behavior of being just like a busybody. Red squirrels spend the whole summer going up and dropping pine cones and then peeling them and bringing the pine nuts down into a midden, into like a underground cache, like just like a mess of tunnels that they create, and they store tens of thousands of pine nuts, high fatty, high calorie protein snack. And the bears can sniff those out, and then bears have big claws for digging and will dig up these caches. And so they get all dirty, they get thirsty, and then they come and kind of check out this bathtub. So it's like, it seems like there was, it's kind of a surprise that there wasn't like a bear that would be kind of king of the tub, so to speak. And it didn't exist. They were kind of probably these seasonal movement bears that were coming up into this area just for that time of year in the fall, and then going back down lower elevations to hibernate, or how they did it. So that was kind of surprised, with just like how much variety, how much behavior and kind of interaction you could glean from just these cameras being out there.
Sounds like a party.
Yeah.
So you have also done a lot of wildlife film work, which you mentioned earlier. Can you tell us a little bit about the difference in the creative process there? Do you approach filming different than photography, and do you find yourself preferring one over the other?
I've always balanced both in projects. Like, I feel like there's a lot of value and impact to a still frame, to a photo moment that's frozen. Whoever's looking at it has to kind of sit with it. It's quieter. It's a bit more contemplative. It can be impactful. It can be a loud image. It can be kind of gritty, but it's still like this moment. And that's something that, we can't do as humans. I mean, we could look at something and close our eyes, and try to just like hold the visual in our mind, like a still photo. But in general, especially with like motion or things happening, or these camera traps, it's like, okay, that's a moment that a physical human, could never experience. I could never be under a wolf at a carcass or at the bear bathtub while grizzly bears are taking a bath. It wouldn't happen. The behavior wouldn't be there. They'd be scared. And then film is, it's how we see. It's how we see the world, unless it's, slow motion or whatever it is. But it's how we see the world. So there's power to both in a way that is very unique. And I think, video gets the closest to actually pulling the human viewer into a place and immersing them. There's motion, there's sound, there's this experience that is tapping into more senses than just kind of like the still frame does, in a way. The still frame can be very emotional in itself and the power of that moment. But with video, it's trying its best we can to translate a place. Having that motion, sound, the movement of an animal, how they communicate, how they talk to each other, the sounds of it, even with people. You can write a description of a person Next step up, you take a photograph of the person, a portrait, and the next step up for kind of like capturing their true essence in a way is like a, an interview, or them just kind of speaking, talking, mannerisms, movement, how that person wants to portray themselves is kind of how video, one of the powers of video that I am drawn to in comparison to photos. You can balance a lot with each, but yeah, I kind of do. Yeah, I always have a video component with all of my projects, and I've been filming in 2021 and 2022. I did a couple sequences for Planet Earth 3, just came out in the UK. It'll air here in another month or so. But chimps in Uganda in kind of human-dominated landscape, and then the same family of Arctic wolves in Canada. And that'll be, that's a 5 to 10 minutes, let's say, sequence. So sequence is just like a clip about a subject within an hour-long episode. And that's kind of how some of these bigger blue chip style, they call them, natural history series are done, where they reach tens of millions of people. And it's this way to kind of like, again, it's like a taste, like draw people in. Again, it's 10 minutes, but you can do a lot in that with the craft of video, and it reaches that's the thing, is like a lot of content consumed as video. So again, if my goal initially for this work with photography, it's kind of mission driven, impact driven. Photography is one piece, but then video is kind of this other piece that can reach a much wider audience.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting perspective on the different roles of those different tools. You mentioned a bit ago that sort of the power of a camera trap would be putting you somewhere that you can't be, like under a wolf. But what are some memorable moments, or a memorable moment that you've actually witnessed when you've been out in the field with your camera?
Yeah, the Arctic is a place where a specific location in the Arctic where I go to, wolves aren't hunted or trapped. There's no human competition on the landscape, which is kind of the crux of where the human-wolf relationship changed. And therefore you're able to kind of like the dream subject, chimpanzees that I've worked with that are habituated to human presence, meaning that they've been exposed to humans over decades, and they'll fall asleep in your presence, and you can walk around and they'll keep sleeping. And the wolves are like that in this place in the Arctic where I go on Ellesmere Island. And, it's somewhat kind of like going to Antarctica, where the penguins don't care because they're just like, oh, yeah, we don't really know what you're about. We didn't really generationally evolve to fear you. It's like that with the wolves. And so basically what it allows for is 24-hour observations of their life. It's helped by the fact that the summer, when I'm mostly there, it never gets dark. The sun doesn't set for 4 months. And so literally you can follow them all night. The sun's still up. And there's a memorable scene that played out over the course of this summer that I was watching these wolves while I was filming for Planet Earth 3, where when I first found the wolves, there was one wolf that had a really awful kind of almost like a golf ball sized hole in his chest cavity, in his lungs. He had a sucking chest wound, like a really horrific injury that I assumed had happened because of a muskox horn, which is their main prey animal. It's a big goat-related, shaggy, Arctic specialized animal. And they have really sharp horns, and that's their defense, and wolves can get hooked. And just, you could hear air kind of like wheezing in and out. He was in a lot of pain. You could tell, just kind of like stiff-necked when he'd lay down. He wasn't really sleeping. And I didn't know if he was going to make it. It just seemed like one of these awful injuries. And over the course of the summer, so this was 2.5 months that I was there, he would lick it a little bit. Other pack mates would come and lick it and just kind of keep it cleaned up. And it started to heal over those months. And, he never he never was left behind. He would be in the back of the pack when they would travel. He would still do 30-mile days with his family, but he wasn't playing and he wasn't really helping in the hunts because of his injury. And then over the months, he started to play more. He was sleeping better. His wound was getting smaller. He started to be kind of at the front some of these hunts where he'd be happy to lead. He was feeling strong. And it was a pretty amazing moment of resilience, of kind of this care that happens. The other wolves one wolf would come by and lick it for 5 minutes, and he would sit there at the end and like lick their face for like a minute afterwards, kind of in this like sweet little human social animal bonding where it feels good. You release dopamine and serotonin, like there's these feel good hormones that come out of that physical interaction. So he was kind of in a way kind of thanking the others for helping him out, and it's amazing to see that what animals are capable of in the natural world. Even these devastating injuries, a sucking chest wound, having a lung collapse as a human, like I don't know what would happen if you didn't get care for that. It would likely get infected. That's kind of a lot of what takes us out, is infection. So that was certainly a memorable scene and moment, and something that allows you to understand these individual lives, and come from the research background where a lot of it is kind of the population, the sum of, we kind of generalize a population with thousands of observations of their behavior, but there's equally and more of these little moments in lives that happen that are, there isn't a sum of kind of that injury, let's say, to like summarize, this is what happens when an animal gets a lung puncture. And so you're observing in this way that is kind of it's a new way to kind of understand animals' lives when they're not scared of you, and you can gain little insights and anecdotes, and they become these stories that help to pull people into being empathetic and understanding and wanting to learn more.
Yeah, I would never have thought that would be a survivable injury.
Same. I was expecting him to decline.
Yeah.
And I just saw him this summer. So that was, when that happened, that was 2021. 2023, just saw him this summer. The wound actually opened up again.
Really?
Yeah. But it doesn't seemingly, he might be walking around with one lung, but it doesn't seem to affect him. I mean, he was playing and doing all, being a wolf, but yeah, still kind of like wincing every now and then. It wasn't fully painless.
Wow. Yeah. What an incredible thing to have witnessed. Ronan, do you have a favorite image that you've ever captured?
There's a handful of images I've mentioned a few times, like when an animal trusts humans enough to fall asleep around them. That offers just a rare, quiet, subtle, but I think they become really powerful images, because most of what we see in wildlife photography or film, video, planet Earth, is like animals are doing stuff all the time, is kind of the narrative. And a lot of those, if you have only 10 minutes to pull people in, you're probably not going to have any minutes of sleeping wolves, let's say. But that's most of what they do. Most animals sleep a lot. All mammals, social animals, highly intelligent, with, large brains, us included. We have to sleep a lot and reset. And wolves are the same. They travel long distances. They ask a lot of their bodies, and their social minds are complex enough that, they also need 10 to 15 hours of nap time. Anybody that has a dog is probably pretty aware of this sort of thing. They work hard, but then they sleep hard. Those images, I think, are, they're quiet. They're not like a takedown predation moment where wolves are hunting something. But I think that they're equally as important to remind people that a lot of animals lead quiet lives. That there are, in the case of wolves, they have an incredible stamina. They travel long distances and they bump into prey. And the bumping into prey, the physical, like mouth on prey, is really just like, 1% of their life is that moment of kind of intensity that is the culmination of all that they have evolved to do in a lot of ways. But there's this other element, so there's some images from the Arctic where this polygon pack is, they're sleeping. There's maybe like someone's chewing on a bone nearby. There's a pile of puppies and they're asleep. And there's kind of this just quiet scene that's happening. And they are trusting and allow for me to be able to walk around and take pictures of them in that moment. And I think that those are some of my favorite images.
Yeah, I love that answer. What is your hope for the impact that wildlife photography can have on conservation? How would you kind of distill that for yourself?
Hope for me with the images that I create is that they'll reach an individual person, touch them in a way emotionally, curiosity, awe. Just being in awe of something is an amazingly powerful emotion and tool to pull people in. And to kind of, a lot of what I'm focusing on now with like the human-wolf relationship is to help showcase like possibilities. A lot of photojournalism can be covering conflict. It's very loud. It's very photogenic, whether it's, war photography, conflict photography in the literal sense, or, where wolves are killed because of a management issue, or where wolves are hunted. Like that's a loud image that's like hits people in a way that's can be kind of triggering in one way or another. But I'd like to give people like an option, like a creative outlet. Like, hey, there's this whole group of people in Europe that live alongside wolves. That there's 3,000 wolves in Spain, 3,000 wolves in Italy. Yes, there's high conflict. There's a lot of low prey base, wild prey. So there's kind of only livestock that's left. So there's a huge conflict in France and Italy with sheep and wolves. But it's kind of, they're figuring it out in certain ways. There's different practices that are used. Having shepherds, having livestock guard dogs. There's a lot of livestock growers that use those in the West. In wolf country, in predator country, they've always done that because that's kind of how you do it. So trying to showcase like hopeful stories in a way that can impact somebody who's kind of curious about wolves and coexistence. Like, just if people don't know what's possible, then they maybe don't know how to dream about it. And be creative about it. So that's kind of the hope, is that I kind of offer some creative thought to dealing with potential conflict, because ultimately nobody wants conflict in their life. On the landscape, people are just trying to make a living a lot of times, and as well as the wildlife. And so it's just, coexistence is about that, how to like minimize conflict.
Yeah. I like that you mentioned awe. I feel like I keep hearing that there's a lot of emerging research on just how powerful that experience is for people. And it feels like there's a lot of potentially untapped potential surrounding the experience of awe.
Yeah, there's a book that I've started listening to. I can't remember the name of it, but it's like The Science of Awe. Maybe halfway through it. Yeah, and one of the writers that informs a lot of my thinking related to the natural world is Barry Lopez. And he talks a lot about awe and agape and these powerful emotions that just they just floor us, and it's in a beautiful way. That's seeing a beautiful sunset, stuff that leaves you speechless, has this emotional connection and power that you will never forget when you've been in awe. And I think it's one of those, it can be a rarer emotion. And the modern human world, like, we try to hijack that with kind of all of our tools, motion pictures, cinema, movies, TV, concerts. They're just like, it's like a awe arms race to try to like blow your mind. But the natural world's been doing that forever. The night sky is just, that's what awesome is it's incredible. And I think that it's always available. you know, the natural world in many ways. I mean, I say that most people are urban, but you can still go out and to parks and find that. I mean, the highest density of like peregrine falcons, I think, is in New York City. And I've been in like Central Park and just like looking up at pigeons just getting like poofed by peregrines. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I recently heard, I wish I could remember where, that one definition of awe was the experience of like utter unself-consciousness. And
I like that.
yeah, I liked that too. This just like in this world where we spend so much time sort of thinking about ourselves and our place in it and what we're doing and how we look and who we are and what we're buying and all of the stuff, that to have this sort of gift of an almost out of body experience of just being amazed by something. And like you said, that the natural world holds that for us also kind of amazes me, because, you know, we are part of it, and the night sky, you know, in one sense should be this like incredibly mundane thing. Like it's just there. And so it feels like such a gift that we get to look at something like that and have an experience of awe and amazement.
Yeah, I like that. Kind of just like shatters the ego. You're just present there. To me, it's the most kind of like centered, balanced, present times that I experience are when I'm immersed in these kind of natural systems. This last trip to the Arctic, I was there for 2 weeks with a science team looking at this climate change relationship to musk oxen. And then for 2 weeks I was by myself and set up a little base camp in this beautiful little sandstone rocky area. I could cache food under rocks, so I didn't have to worry about it. When I left during the day, I would go down in this big basin and hike maybe 10 to 15 miles a day, check with these wolves that I spent a lot of time with, hang out with them for days, follow muskoxen, watch Arctic fox kits play around camp. And there was no human sounds. Every sound had a purpose in the natural world. The long-tailed Jaeger call, the bird that kind of alarms when a fox comes by or when a human walks by, they kind of dive bomb. And they have different calls for the land threats. They have different calls for territorial threats that are coming in, other Jaegers coming in. And you just start to, for me, it's kind of this unraveling of kind of the husk of the modern human world that kind of blocks us as modern humans from that experience. I had physical back pain and hip stuff going into this trip and came out of it, and I was like, my back pain's got what? Yeah. Stress, anxiety, kind of these things that we're so kind of accustomed to in the modern world all just kind of started to chip away. And that's something that I always go back to, is that kind of baseline reset in the natural world and finding kind of that attunement and just the presence of it. So yeah, it's a magical thing.
Totally. Okay, Ronan, we have a few listener questions for you.
Fun.
Okay, first question. Dan from Idaho asks, generally, how many hours filming in the wild does it take to produce a 1-hour documentary for wolves, bears, mountain lions?
The Arctic Wolf series that myself and a team made for National Geographic, it's 3 TV hours, so each one is like 45 minutes of actual footage. I think we filmed somewhere around 200 hours.
Wow.
For that. So yeah, the ratio of used versus unused is quite large in the unused category. So yeah, it takes, same with a bear bathtub, that was 5 months maybe total of like cameras out capturing footage. And we made a maybe 3 to 5 minute clip about it, about that. So it's, that's hard to me. It's like we're trying to convey, even in 3 hours, even in 20 hours, you couldn't actually convey what this place is and kind of the day-to-day life of an animal. It's like even being there, I'm not seeing it all or capturing it all, even though I'm physically seeing it. So yeah, it's always this kind of challenge.
Yeah, wild.
Yeah, and same with photos. I mean, I think we published, 12 photos, let's say, in the magazine article that I did on Arctic wolves. And camera traps, that's tens of thousands of pictures right there. I think it was like 130,000 images is like my catalog from that 3 months.
I can't even imagine what it would take to choose.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's nice. I have an editor. Kathy Moran, she's amazing, and she goes through every frame.
Unreal.
Which is wild, yeah.
Okay, next question. Stephanie from Wyoming wants to know what your very first camera was.
I think my mom had, I don't know if she still does, but like the Minolta film camera. I feel like I borrowed that for the high school black and white class that I took, I think. But the first like camera that I bought right before I went to that spotted owl project in Yosemite was a Canon Rebel something. It was a film camera, just like a cheap, small plastic body. So I guess we'll call that my first camera.
Good. Okay, next question, which is sort of unintentionally, I think, a follow-up. Liz from New York asks, what camera do you use now?
Currently, I use a Canon R5. It's one of their new mirrorless systems. Mirrorless is a huge advancement in photography for a lot of reasons, but one is that it has like opened up the access to photography. Digital did that to start just because it's like you don't have to pay to get film produced. You can instantly see what your picture is, so you can instantly learn and change and do that. With mirrorless, it's that elevated. So the mirrorless means that literally you're kind of looking at a screen, and your exposure is what you're seeing. So it's kind of like your phone, your cell phone. You take it out and you see the exposure. How light and dark things are. Is what the picture's going to look like. And before you had to meter and try to you had to have some understanding of whatever, some technical stuff. But I teach photo workshops with National Geographic and places all around the world, and we bring a kit of mirrorless cameras with us, and we hand them out. We do maybe 20 students. I've done them in Rwanda and Mongolia, all around the world, where a lot of students had never seen a camera or picked up a camera. And with mirrorless, you just show them exposure compensation, lightening and darkening just with a wheel, a flick of the thumb. And they can create these like incredible exposed images that would be very hard if you had to like meter, if you had to try to predict, you'd be very frustrated. So mirrorless, great.
No, I actually really appreciate you
That's my
explaining that.
Quick answer.
Because I was like, well, I take it there's no mirror, but that's about the extent of my knowledge. So that's wonderful. Okay. Martin from Illinois asks, has your equipment ever failed in the field before? And if so, what did you do?
Yeah, I've had a lot of equipment that's failed. It's kind of part of the job. You always bring a backup camera, but I have flooded multiple cameras. So like a few in the Yellowstone project where I was trying to set up camera traps in the Lamar River in this section where bison would cross. And it was in the fall during migration. Bison move in and out of Yellowstone by the thousands in the winter, and they stage in the fall. And I left the camera too long, and there was an ice jam, like an ice dam that was created down river, and it flooded this whole area and flooded these cameras and the whole system. And it was they were National Geographic, so I had to call them, and they were understanding. They didn't, they're covered by insurance and maybe pay for things, but good learning experience about that. I've had a wolf steal a camera from me in the Arctic, like one that was right next to me at my feet. I was just kind of didn't expect that she would be so bold. It was right when I first met this polygon pack that I've spent a lot of time with, and one of the wolves that I've called her Bright Eyes, she very mischievous, and she darted in and grabbed this camera. It was like a 1D Mark II, big $8,000 camera with a lens that was also National Geographic's, and had to yeah, it was this funny moment of I found myself reactively like chasing her like I would a dog that just stole something. And then in the chasing, realizing, oh, I know this game. It's the keep away game. And it's only fun when you're being chased. And so I, like what I've done with dogs, you stop, turn around, and start walking away. And she was like, oh, turned, started trotting behind me. Like, hey, like, I still have your thing. You want to play? And I kind of side-eyed her over my shoulder. She got close enough. I turned and clapped really quickly and startled her, and she dropped the camera and like darted away. And I was able to get it back. So that was a disaster averted. But yeah, it's kind of having a backup camera is just part of the job, especially if you're going to a really remote place. So that's a good advice. Backup camera, and then UV like lens filters. Another one I've been saved many times where you face down, drop a lens or drop a camera, and that shatters, but not the actual front element of your lens, which is much worse. So.
Amazing. Well, that was a great story. Okay, just a few more follow-up, or I should say wrap-up questions for you. Any just wildlife photography tips for folks out and about around the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, going to Yellowstone is great. You get this abundance and access and kind of landscape that's open across like the northern range of Yellowstone. That's really amazing stuff you can see just from the road driving around. But I think, I brought up earlier, but access is really the most important thing. You can have all the cameras, all the skill, but if you don't know the subject or have access to the subject, you're not going to be able to make any pictures or make good pictures. So like for people who are interested in wildlife photography, don't start trying to take pictures of wolverines, probably. That would be very hard. Stuff that's more accessible around trying to there's parks where there's just tons of ducks or, swans or, stuff that's like kind of semi-captive, or that it's like gives you kind of opportunity to go there every day, different light, and try to experiment and understand your equipment. Because ultimately, if you try to go for harder stuff, or if there's really rare events or things that are happening fast, you want to have a good familiarity with your equipment, so that you're able to make the right choices and not be frustrated at the end of it with blurry pictures or dark pictures or stuff where you missed it. So yeah, getting to know your camera, and then people who can afford it, it's great to hire guides in Yellowstone that are amazing. There's a lot of amazing photographers that are guides that work for various tour companies in Yellowstone, and they know where to go, and they know the animals, and know that lots of natural history stories and geology, and can kind of really immerse you in that place. That's any of the parks in Africa, you hire guides and you get a very amazing experience. It's kind of unique to the U.S. that we kind of get to go into our natural spaces, which is great, but alone, without guides, but it adds a whole lot. So that's just an option for people that want that or know that that's available.
Okay, great. I like that. So it's know your equipment, and if you can, go with someone who knows what they're doing.
Yeah. Yep.
Perfect. What are you currently working on?
I am working on a few different projects. One is a National Geographic Magazine story about how beavers can help keep water on landscapes, especially in the arid western United States. That's coming out. It's supposed to publish early next year. And I have a long-term project for National Geographic Society about human-wolf relationships around the world. And that'll be some travel to Europe and Asia next year. Yeah, and then a bunch of other stuff, but those are the two kind of big things. That museum exhibit in Bend, Oregon, and that goes to Eugene, Oregon next year, and also Portland as well, Portland, Oregon next year. So it'll be there.
Perfect segue. What are some of the places that people can see your work?
People can see my work. Instagram is probably most used for me. Just my name, Ronan Donovan. National Geographic's published a handful of articles of my work. I have a recent article out in Montana Outdoors about great gray owls and the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks 5-year survey for them. An article in Big Sky Journal coming out this month as well about wildlife watching in Yellowstone.
Wonderful. Okay, final question for you, which is the same question that we ask all of our guests here on this podcast. Who is your conservation hero?
I would say my conservation hero is getting back to the work of Barry Lopez. His approach to the human experience related to the natural world and conveying that to, a modern world, making it accessible, bringing people into indigenous lives and communities in the Arctic, for example, in Arctic Dreams, as well as wildlife communities. And that feeling of awe is interspersed throughout so much of his writing that I feel like that's a really powerful way to draw people in who have never been to a landscape or visited a place. Is, pick up Arctic Dreams, or the seminal work on the wolf-human relationship is Of Wolves and Men that he wrote in the 80s. I'll say Barry Lopez.
Perfect answer. All right, Ronan Donovan, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. It was absolutely wonderful to speak with you.
Likewise, thank you.
Another enormous thank you to Ronan for stopping by the podcast today and sharing his incredible stories from the field. We hope you feel inspired to use your own storytelling skills, whether it's photography, writing, painting, graphic design, public speaking, or any of the million other ways to speak up for the conservation issue that's near and dear to your heart. To see more of Ronan's work, you can check out his Instagram and website, both of which are linked in the show notes. If you'd also like to hear more about Ronan's work on Ellesmere Island with Arctic wolves, we've added a link to Ronan's series, Kingdom of the White Wolf, which you can watch on Disney+. After we recorded this episode, Ronan sent over some footage of the bear bathtub that you can check out on our website. Spoiler alert, it's adorable. All right, now for the giveaway. By becoming a podcast supporter between now and December 31st, 2023, you'll be entered to win one of 10 available printed copies of the Yellowstone edition of National Geographic Magazine. All you need to do is sign up, and we'll put your name in the drawing for early 2024. You can access this contest via the link in our show notes as well, or on this podcast episode's page on the Greater Yellowstone Coalition's website. This magazine includes many stunning photos from Ronan and also features stories about the power of the park by renowned author David Quammen, the relationship between wildlife and the people who live here, and the geology of Yellowstone. Voices of Greater Yellowstone is a podcast by the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, a conservation nonprofit that works with all people to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.